అందరికీ స్వాగతం. ఈరోజు సుందరయ్య విజ్ఞాన కేంద్రం తరఫున ఇటీవల మరోసారి వార్తల్లోకి ఎక్కినటువంటి అదానీ కుంభకోణం గురించి మనం వెబినార్ నిర్వహిస్తున్నాము. అదానీ కుంభకోణం, ప్రధాని మౌనం. ఈ వెబినార్ని జేఎన్యూలో ఆర్థిక శాస్త్ర అధ్యాపకులుగా పనిచేసి రిటైర్ అయినటువంటి ఆర్థికవేత్త ప్రొఫెసర్ అరుణ్ కుమార్ గారు నిర్వహిస్తున్నారు. అదానీ గురించి మనం చాలా కాలం నుంచి కుంభకోణానికి సంబంధించినటువంటి వార్తలు వింటున్నాము. ఆయన మారిషస్ లో ఉన్నటువంటి నామకే వస్తే కంపెనీల పేర డబ్బులు ఆ కంపెనీలు తన కంపెనీలో పెట్టుబడులు పెట్టుకున్నాయని చెప్పేసి చూపించి ఆ విధంగా తన షేర్స్ ను వీటిని పెంచుకుంటున్నాడు. కానీ యాక్చువల్ గా అటువంటి కంపెనీలు ఏవి లేవు. అవి పెట్టుబడులు పెట్టగలిగినటువంటి కంపెనీలు కావు. ఆయన మారిషస్ లో ఉండే కంపెనీలు ఏవని చెప్తున్నాడో అవి. ఇది చాలా కాలం నుంచి వార్తల్లో వచ్చింది. ఇటీవల జర్నలిస్టులు ఒక ఇన్వెస్టిగేషన్ చేసి తేల్చింది ఏంటంటే ఆ కుంభకోణం వాస్తవము అని తేల్చారు. దాని వివరాలు కూడా వెల్లడించారు. ఇప్పుడు మనము తనకు ప్రతిపక్షంగా ఉన్నటువంటి పార్టీలకు సంబంధించినటువంటి నాయకుల మీద, తమకు అనుకూలంగా లేనటువంటి వాళ్ళ మీద కేంద్ర ప్రభుత్వము, కేంద్రంలోని ఇంటెలిజెన్స్ ఏజెన్సీస్ దాడులు చేస్తున్నాయి. అవి విజిలెన్స్ దాడులు కానీ, ఈడీ దాడులు కానీ, లేకపోతే ఇన్కమ్ ట్యాక్స్ దాడులు కానీ, ఇవన్నీ కూడా కేవలం ఒక రాజకీయ కారణంగా చేస్తున్నాయి. ఇక్కడ ఇన్ని వార్తలు వెలువడినప్పటికీ కూడా అదానీ కంపెనీల మీద అక్కడ ఏం జరుగుతుంది అని పరిశీలించేటువంటి చొరవ కానీ, లేకపోతే ఆసక్తి కానీ ప్రధానమంత్రి చూపించటం లేదు. ఆయన మౌనంగా ఉన్నాడు. ఇప్పటి వరకు ప్రధాని కానీ, ప్రభుత్వం కానీ ఆ వస్తున్నటువంటి వార్తలకు సంబంధించినటువంటి ఒక్క ప్రకటన కూడా చేయలేదు. అసలు ఈ కుంభకోణం ఏమిటి, ఇందులో ఉన్నటువంటి అంశాలు ఏమిటి, అదేవిధంగా ప్రధాని మౌనం వహించడానికి కారణం ఏంటి? ఇప్పుడు అదానీ ఒక పారిశ్రామికవేత్తనే కాదు, ఒక పెద్ద వార్తా సంస్థకి, ఛానల్కి ఆయన అధిపతి. ఎన్డీటీవీకి ఇప్పుడు అధిపతి ఆయన. మన మన వాళ్ళ నుంచి కొనేశారు. రాధికా రాయ్, ప్రణయ్ రాయ్ల నుంచి ఎన్డీటీవీని కొనేశారు. అక్కడ చాలా మార్పులు జరిగాయి. సో ఆ సంస్థ కూడా అదానీ అయినటువంటి యజమాని అయినటువంటి అదానీ చేస్తున్నటువంటి కుంభకోణాలు ఏమిటి అనేటువంటివి ఇప్పుడు మనం తెలుసుకుందాము. మొదట ప్రొఫెసర్ అరుణ్ కుమార్ గారు ఒక 40 నిమిషాల పాటు వారు మాట్లాడతారు. వారు ఇంగ్లీష్ లో మాట్లాడతారు. దాన్ని కామ్రేడ్ వీరయ్య గారు తెలుగులోకి అనువదిస్తారు. ఆ తర్వాత వారు ప్రశ్నల్ని కూడా టేకప్ చేసి వాటికి సమాధానాలు చెప్తారు. నౌ ఐ రిక్వెస్ట్ ప్రొఫెసర్ అరుణ్ కుమార్ జీ టు స్టార్ట్ హిస్ అడ్రస్.
Thank you, Mr. Vinay Kumar. Thank you, Veeraiah, for inviting me and making it possible. Especially Mr. Veeraiah will be translating, which will make it accessible to other people. I began by thanking and also this thing. So let me get on to the subject. So as an introduction, one of the sharpest rise of the group of companies in India and then equally sharp fall in the valuation of the companies after January 24-23 has been commented on both because of the rise and the fall. So the question is, how did the valuation of Adani Group companies become so astronomically high? And the conglomerate has presence in all kinds of areas. It has presence in coal, its production, in power generation, in transmission, in road construction, data centers, airports, ports, roads, media, logistics, natural gas, distribution, real estate, and so many things. And it has also won very large tenders from the government. When the share prices fell, the Supreme Court took notice and therefore Supreme Court asked an expert committee consisting of corporates largely to go into the matter. But the expert committee report hit a stone wall because the official agencies could not tell it what was actually going on. So SEBI was not able to probe according to the expert committee because of the change in the laws in 2018. Now, what has happened is that in the USA, there is a group called OCCRP, which looks at the fraud committed by companies, and they have obtained files, multiple tax haven records, bank records, internal Adani Group emails, and they have shed light on the matter which SEBI could not. So Hindenburg revelations are important. So let us begin with that. You know, what they accused was the Adani Group has massively manipulated the stock market and others. And they say that this is the largest con in corporate history. So Hindenburg says Adani Group stocks were overvalued by 85%. And Adani's responded by saying that this attack is misconceived. Politically, the short selling was described as an attack on India growth story by the government and by Adani. The question is, where does the truth lie? With Hindenburg or with Adani denial? So the questions we can ask, even if we don't look at Hindenburg report, how did Adani's become so rich so suddenly? They were 40th or 50th richest people, and they became the second richest people and the third richest people. How have they managed to acquire huge amount of assets so quickly? You know, ports, airports, everything they were acquiring very, very quickly. And what were the sources of funds through which they could acquire all these assets so quickly? Now, we have to see that they floated the public offer in January called the FPO. How did that get subscribed fully? Where did the money come from? The regulatory and the investigative agencies, have they played their part in the investigation of the sudden rise of the Adanis? Are there signals from the top which facilitate the growth of the Adanis? And what is the role of Vinod Adani, the elder brother of Gautam Adani? And what has been pointed out now by OCCRP, Nasir Ali and Chan Chung Ling. So let us look at the pattern of holding in the biggest Adani company called ADEL. Now, in the AEL, the Adani Enterprises Limited, in February end, 72.6% was the holding of the promoters. This is little bit below what is allowed, 75%. So they have kept it at 72.6%. So public holding in most of the Adani companies is very small. And now what we find is that a part of the holding by foreign people or by the others is also the promoters. This is what the OCCRP now proves. So therefore, the holding by the Adani Group is more than 75%, which is illegal. Hindenburg is a company which does short selling. And short selling is possible where the price of the equity is much higher than the natural price of the equity. So the short selling was done abroad. It could not be done in India because nobody would dare to do it. Yeah. Now, therefore, even after the decline of the prices that took place after the short selling, on March 8, the price earning ratio was 112 and the dividend yield was 0.049%. Usually for most companies, the price earning ratio is between 15 and 25. But here it was 112, even after the decline. That means before the decline, it was more than 200, the price earning ratio. compared to the normal of 15 to 25. Compared to other large conglomerates, whether it be Reliance or Tata's or it be Jindal's or Bajaj Group, the profit that is declared is much smaller for the equity that is held, and the employment generation is much smaller than in those companies for the market capitalization of the Adani companies, showing that the market capitalization of Adani Group is much, much higher than is justified. So let us look at the factors why the share price valuation of Adani was very high. The first is that they could get assets at very cheap prices. And because of that, they could show a higher profitability. And because of that higher profitability, they could make their company share prices rise. And their own companies abroad were investing in raising the price of their shares. So some black money was going from India abroad, and that was being routed, what is called round tripping, into the Adani companies to raise the share prices. The managements also have friendly stockbrokers, managers of mutual funds, etc., who help to raise the price of the equity. The global financial architecture allows black money from India to be taken abroad for round tripping. And also the black money that is going abroad could belong to the company or the promoters, or it could belong to some other people who are investing their black money into the Adani companies. Earlier Hindenburg and now OCCRP, they are trying to show that this was the way that the company had a larger amount of money going in. So the promoters holding was more than 75%. Once the share price becomes high, then you can leverage that and you can borrow from the banks and then again put that money into the companies through the shell companies. So again raising the price of the share again further and further. Capitalism is synonymous with cronyism. So in India, many businesses have connections with the political class, with the policy makers and others, and they use that to actually enrich their companies and so on, to make bigger and so on. So there were accusations of corruption in many cases in India earlier also, whether it be like, in the case of Enron or, in other companies coming into India. So there is a nexus that is there between the political class and the business class, which is being used in all these cases. So like borrowing from LIC, the loans from State Bank of India, they could also all be possible because of the connections with the political class and the policymakers. We see in South Korea also, like the chaebols, like Daewoo, etc. They were accused. The president was had to leave because of the corruption charges. Then in Japan also, the prime ministers had to leave in the 90s because they were supposed to be helping the corporate sector. In the USA, the Enron and the case that was around Enron and the other cases were there. So this is a global phenomena where capitalist class and the political class, they collaborate with each other. In the world, we have seen a sudden rise of wealth in the last 10 years, say like Jeff Bezos and so on, so there it was technology. But in the case of Adani, they have not developed technology. They have acquired assets very cheap using crony capitalism. So in India, for instance, the Mumbai airport could be acquired. Similarly, ACC cement company, which is very profitable, that could be acquired recently. Another cement company could be acquired. Contracts could be obtained because of the pressure and the closeness to the powers that be. And in this, the agencies were used to scare the businessmen into selling their assets cheap to the Adani group. Those businessmen whose assets were acquired, they have denied that there was pressure, but this is also due to fear. So it is not that, the assets did not become available cheap to the Adanis. So this is something that we have to look at. And then we have to see that even abroad, as was said in the parliament, wherever the Prime Minister went, there either directly when the Prime Minister went or a little later, Mr. Adani could get certain assets or certain contracts. In this context, the coal mine in Australia, the Haifa port in Israel, the project in Sri Lanka, in Indonesia, all these are being mentioned, which became available to the Adanis after the visit of the Prime Minister or during the visit of the Prime Minister. But the investigative agencies which should be looking into these matters are not doing that, probably because of the closeness to the powers that be. For instance, through the Adani port, rupees 30,000 crore rupees worth of drugs came in. But we don't know what has happened to the investigation. It is such a huge amount, and after 30,000 crores came, another 2,000 crores was said to have come. But we don't know what has happened to that investigation. Similarly, because of the high price to earning ratio, the SEBI should have been investigating how the price earning ratio has become so high, but SEBI is also not investigated. So I think it is a signal that Adanis are close to the powers that be, that the investigative agencies don't investigate, or they give clean chit, like in the case that now has come out in the open, that DRI had written to the SEBI about certain transactions taking place which needed to be investigated, but they were not investigated, and the case was closed. And in 2018, the rule was changed so that you could not investigate who the real people were behind certain funds that were coming. And that is what the Supreme Court committee, the expert committee, has also pointed out, that SEBI is not able to get to the true owners because of this rule change that took place in 2018. And that's why there's a brick wall which is preventing finding out the real people behind. But now the OCCRP report that is pointing towards that it is Mr. Vinod Adani, and through Mr. Vinod Adani, the funds were coming to these companies. And earlier, it was denied by Adani companies that Vinod Adani was a promoter group. Later on, it was accepted that Vinod Adani is a part of the promoter group. Then there is another issue that should have been warning the companies, and that is that many people are saying that the debt to the equity ratio is very high. This is called the gearing ratio. When the gearing ratio is high, then the risk is increasing. Now, when the risk is high, at that time, why is it that SEBI did not investigate? Why is it that the RBI did not investigate? Because if the debt is very high compared to the equity, then there's a problem. LIC was investing when the mutual funds, the private mutual funds, were not investing. So that also seems to suggest that there was pressure under which LIC invested. Then banks were giving money when the high ratio was there, the gearing ratio. Then that should have been investigated by the RBI. When the Fitch subsidiary reported last year the high gearing ratio, immediately the Adanis arranged for funds to be brought in, from Dubai and other places. So obviously, large amount of funds are available through the black economy route and through the round tripping route for the Adanis to manage this situation. But the point remains why the RBI and SEBI and other agencies did not investigate the high gearing ratio. Then the FPO, the public offer that was done in January end, that is also instructive, because suddenly 20,000 crores of rupees worth of FPOs came. But the price at which it was to be sold was 3,200 rupees. But because of Hindenburg, after 24, the price had dropped to 2,700. When the price was lower in the market, why did people subscribe at 3,200 rupees? They could have procured from the market at 2,700 rupees. So that shows that this was not genuine investor, but the money of the promoter group which was being invested to subscribe to the FPO. The last day, because the retail subscription was not there, the rich Indians, the names have come out, whether it be for the Airtel owner or whether it be the Jindals or it be the other rich Indians, they have subscribed massively to make it successful 20,000 crores of subscription. Now, they could have also, if they were serious, they could have also acquired in the market at much lower price, but they paid the price of the FPO. That must have been under pressure because nobody would invest at the actual price being low. Nobody would invested at the FPO price. So it shows that even the rich Indian businessmen were under pressure to invest and make the FPO successful. But what happened was that because there was a problem, and therefore the FPO itself was cancelled the next day. The reason why the FPO was withdrawn was because probably the rich people were assured that their money would come back to them, and the second is that the Adani Group itself needed the money so that they could give the banks the money, because when you borrow from the bank, you get only a fraction of the total value. Now, when the value declines, then the banks would sell the shares. If the bank started selling the shares, then the price would have dropped further. So that's why the FPO got cancelled. So two reasons FPO got cancelled. One, the rich people's money went back, and B, the Adani Group needed the money to pay to the banks so that the banks don't start selling their equity. So the impact on the economy has been rather bad because it is spoiling the investment climate, and businessmen now are fearing that they can be under pressure for takeover. And that is why high net worth individuals are leaving the country in large numbers. Between 2014 and 2019, 23,000 high net worth individuals left the country. In 2019, 6,000 left the country. And in 2022, again 6,000 people left. So in other words, large number of high net worth individuals are leaving the country. The stock market became panicky, and until March 8th, when the GQG invested funds in the Adani, until then the market was also affected by the decline in the Adani companies. But the question is the GQG fund of some mutual fund, or is it the Adani's funds that are being round tripped through GQG? We don't know. But it is surprising that somebody is investing so much money in a company whose stocks were overvalued and whose price had declined by 65% on an average. The GQG has continued to invest subsequently also. So it is a bit surprising that whether money is being round tripped or it is genuine money, that remains to be found. The impact is that total, the French company with whom Adani's were going to have collaboration, they have dropped the collaboration with Adani. Similarly, many projects of Adani have been either postponed or dropped. So in other words, the investment climate in the country has been affected. So what is happening is that the government is following a twin strategy. The twin strategy is to help large conglomerates to acquire assets. And Adani, Ambani, Tata's, they're all helped to acquire a lot of assets, especially of the public sector, and whether it be airports or whether it be airlines and other such things. So this is the twin strategy to make big business huge, and that's what Adani represents. Adani is particularly favored because it has become very, very huge in a very short period of time. He became richer than Mr. Ambani also, personally richer, and his company came close to the Reliance market capitalization. So what is happening is that this twin strategy means make the big conglomerates very big and keep the poor poor. So keep 80 crore people poor, okay, and you can give them goodies at the time of elections and try and get their vote. On the other hand, promote these big conglomerates. under the Atmanirbhar Bharat announcement in May 2020 during the pandemic, it was said that in all areas only one public sector undertaking will remain, and all other public sector undertakings in that area, whether it be banks or others, they would be privatized. So this is a move that the government has been envisaging for some time, but this government is now putting that into practice. And the government is being using demonetization, the structurally faulty GST, then the digitization, formalization, all these are being used to marginalize the small sector, the unorganized sector, and shift demand from the unorganized sector to the organized sector so that these conglomerates can do well. Data shows, like from trade sector, demand is shifted from the neighborhood store to the e-commerce and to the malls and so on. In the case of FMCG, from the small sector to the large companies. In the case of leather goods sector, in the case of textile sector, in the case of pressure cooker sector, so many sectors are showing that demand is shifted from the unorganized sector and small sector to the organized sector. So the data is not capturing this decline in the unorganized sector. So government says that we are growing at 6%, 7%, but actually we are not growing at more than 1% or 2% or minus 1%. Official data is based largely on the organized sector data and agriculture, but the unorganized sector data is not there, and it is assumed that the unorganized sector is growing at the same rate as the organized sector. So a sector which is declining is represented by a sector which is rising, and that's why I argue that it is overrepresenting GDP growth. So it is not 6%, 7%, but more like 1%, 2%, and minus 1%. And we can see that during demonetization, for the decade of the 2010 to 2020, the highest growth rate was of the economy in the demonetization year of 2016-17. When we saw that for 5 months, people could not go and buy, the markets were empty, production was affected, and yet it was showing the highest growth rate. So they were overestimating the growth rate by maybe 5 or 6% even at that time. So India is not the fastest growing economy at 6%, 7%, and it has not become the 5th largest economy, because from 2016-17 we are overestimating our GDP growth. So we are still probably the 8th or the 9th largest economy in the world, not the 5th largest. And therefore in 5 years we will not become the 3rd largest economy in the world. And official data itself was showing before the pandemic that the rate of growth had dropped from 8% to 3.1% in the quarter just before the pandemic hit us. So in data, we have invisibilized the unorganized sector, and therefore in policy also we have invisibilized. And that's why I have been arguing that the organized sector is colonizing the unorganized sector, because it is taking away the market from the unorganized sector, just like the British took away the market from the Indian producers and the Indian producers suffered. So this is what I call colonization of the unorganized sector by the organized sector. So to conclude, there are many questions that need to be answered around Hindenburg report. And even if we don't say Hindenburg report, even otherwise also, there are many questions that I have raised about the share price, about the money obtained, about the gearing ratio and so on. That's the first point. Second is that the cronyism has played a big role in the rise of the Adani group. And the international financial architecture enables the rich people to manipulate the stock market and manipulate the funds from India going abroad. And there could be political funds also that may be rooted abroad and brought back in various ways. What I have tried to show is that the growth of Adani has been bad for the country, and the decline of the Adani is also bad for the investment climate in the company, because it's creating instability. So both the rise and the fall. And the second point is that the government's twin strategy of creating huge conglomerates and keeping the poor, that seems to be failing. So a full inquiry is required into the Adani issue. The Supreme Court monitored expert committee is inadequate because its terms of reference were limited. SEBI has not done its job that it should have done. And it is surprising that what our agencies could not get, a group of journalists could find. So what kind of investigation was being done by these agencies? So the lack of action by the agencies is because of the pressure from the top, and the top does not want things to be revealed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Arunji. We have a question now. We'll take up questions. One question from Anjaya Permandla. Question is, how can we contest the data released by Government of India in case of GDP calculation?
The reason we can contest is that the unorganized sector data comes only once in 5 years, and it has not been collected after 2015. So there is industry-wise data that is coming that the large-scale sector is expanding at the expense of the small sector and the unorganized sector. And I gave the example of, say, e-commerce. E-commerce has been growing at 20%, 30%, 40%. So at whose expense are they growing? Obviously, the neighborhood store, because the economy is growing even by official account only at 6-7%. So if the official economy is growing at 6-7%, but e-commerce is growing at 20, 30, 40%, then it can only be at the expense of the other sector. Similarly, if you read the Hindustan Unilever report of last year, it said that our market share is going up because the small scale sector is not able to cope. In the pressure cooker industry case, Mr. Jagannathan made the statement that we are 5 units in the organized sector, we are growing at 24%, because the unorganized sector is declining, it is not able to cope with GST. Similarly, in the leather goods sector and so on. So you go by sector, and all the major sectors are saying that the organized sector is growing. Now, if you look at the RBI data for 2,700 non-banking, non-public sector companies, last year their profits increased dramatically at 22%, their sales increased by 40%. Now, when the economy was stagnant, the sales increasing at 40% means it must be at the expense of the unorganized sector and the other smaller sector. So all this data is available. Official data is not available separately for the unorganized sector. So we have to use other data. And that's what I've been doing by using other alternate data to say that the rate of growth is not 6%, 7%, but more like -1, 0, 1, or 2%. And as I said, during demonetization, when it was evident that the economy had gone down, how come the official figure was at 8.1% growth rate, the highest during the decade? That itself points to the fact that the methodology is not correct. Now, the methodology of GDP estimation changes whenever there's a shock to the economy. And we have had many shocks. In 2016, we had the demonetization. In 2017, the GST. In 2018, the NBFC crisis. And then 2020, the sudden lockdown. Because of each of these shocks, the GDP methodology should have been changed, but it has not been changed. So it is not representing the correct figure for the GDP or the GDP growth.
Okay. Now, recently also they announced that last quarter GDP growth is 7.8%. It is also same thing.
Same thing, and I have also pointed out that in this case of the quarterly growth of 7.8%, it is a category called discrepancy, which has changed from -3.2 to 2.6. So it has increased by 6%. Now, discrepancy represents the error in the different ways of counting the GDP. So it shows that the errors are very large. And these errors being very large, it implies that our consumption, our government investment, our export, import, and our investment in the economy, they are not being correctly represented. These are expenditure categories. Now, when the expenditure categories are not properly recorded as compared to the income side of the GDP, then there will be these large errors. So that's what I'm pointing out, that when there are shocks to the economy, then we are not measuring our GDP correctly. And these shocks are resulting in large discrepancy, sometimes large negative amount, sometimes large positive amount, whereas the discrepancy should be usually less than 1%, but we are having large errors in the thing, pointing to what I'm saying, that we are not measuring our GDP correctly.
Okay, there is another question. If Prime Minister helps Adani to buy foreign companies at cheaper rate, what is wrong in it?
No, so I'm not saying that at a cheaper rate, But you see, the companies are coming because of the intervention. And in case of Sri Lanka, it was already said that there was pressure, and that's why we had to give it to Mr. Adani. Similarly, as was said in the parliament, whenever the prime minister has gone abroad, then Mr. Adani has gone with him, or Mr. Adani has gone a day or two later, and then contracts have been awarded. So I'm not saying that they got the asset in those countries cheap. Why would they sell cheap? But even the fact that they are able to acquire assets, things that they have not been working in areas that they're not working in, suddenly they get those assets, that could be due to the political pressure from the top.
There is another question. It is said that Ellen Mittal used to buy properties all over world and became a cheaper rate and became number one rich in the world. Where is he now? What happened to him?
Well, Mr. Mittal is still there, and he never became as rich as Mr. Adani did. But there was a lot of manipulation that was done by them, by also Hinduja group and so on. And it is said usually that there was some not above the board transactions, whether the transactions in Nigeria or whether the transactions in other countries by the Hindujas and by other people, they were not always above board. And they could also be the money being round trip, somebody's black money going abroad and then being under the control of somebody. These are all very murky affairs. We cannot tell who's getting whose money and where the money is coming, that these people suddenly become very wealthy and they rise up, on the basis of, acquiring assets, acquiring contracts and so on. So what the Adani episode shows, that those people who have become very rich suddenly in the last 30, 40 years, there is some cronyism that's going on around them. They're getting, some benefits. And we can see that in the case of Soviet Union's collapse, when it turned into Russia, the kleptocrats, they got the assets. So people who are in the government, who are in prime positions, they suddenly became very wealthy because they could acquire the public sector assets very cheap. And they then, got gas and they got various other things, and they have now become rich billionaires staying in France and Britain and various other places. Many of our rich people are also going to Dubai, going to London, going to New York, going to the islands, the tax havens, etc. So it is all very murky, and we are only able to get their information when the data is stolen. So like in the case of Paradise Papers, Panama Papers, British Virgin Island Papers, then we get the names of all these very wealthy Indians who have got their accounts abroad, but it's all from stolen data. The LGT bank stolen data, the UBS bank stolen data, etc. It's only from there that we are able to get the actual information, and the names of all these people are mentioned in those papers.
There is another question. In what way these scandals help the political party which is in power?
So it is clear that the people who are in league with the political parties and the political leaders, they fund them. So it is not only the electoral bonds through which they are funding. It is the largest amount is through black money, through providing assets. Like giving aeroplanes and giving helicopters for travel. Mr. Modi addressed some 600 rallies in 6 months before the 2014 election. Now that would not have been possible without getting help, in terms of mobilization of money, in terms of, getting aircraft to travel and so on. So therefore, the wealthy people, when there's cronyism, they know that when the people they are favoring, they come to power, they will be able to get good return out of it by being helped. So it's a quid pro quo. So for my Black Economy book in 2019, I interviewed 14 members of parliament who were successful in the 1998 election. And all of them told me that they knew that there was a quid pro quo. They got help from big businessmen, small businessmen, from big politicians. They got help from the local traders. They got help from, other such people. And they said that we know that there's a quid pro quo. We are being given the money, because when we get to power, we will be able to help these people. So all of the politicians realize, and therefore they have to have a nexus. So nowadays elections have become very expensive. We are spending way beyond the election expenditure limit of, say, what was 75 lakh has become 1 crore. But the news was that in 2019 election, people spent anything up to 50 crore, 100 crore for a election of the member of parliament, way beyond. So how do you mobilize those funds? To mobilize those funds, you require to be in close proximity to some big people with a lot of money who will help you. And the people who are helping you are helping so that they will be able to get favored decisions in their favor.
G. Nageshwara, thank you very much, sir, for your analysis whether this study is going to Finance Ministry.
No, I think the Finance Ministry doesn't need this study. The Finance Ministry already knows, and I have written many articles on this matter earlier in various places. So it is not that the Finance Ministry does not know. As I said, you see, the Ministry of Finance and the agencies of the Ministry of Finance, they have the information, but they don't act on it. Like, where the Hawala works from, our agencies know which are the places where the Hawala works from, but they don't raid them, they don't close them. Why? Because there's political pressure. That's why you see the Jain Hawala case in 1990 suddenly erupted and 50 politicians' names came up. But prosecution could not be done. Okay. Again, the agencies are accused by the courts also that you are cage parrot, that you are only acting when there is a political pressure on you. So you are acting against the opposition, but you're not acting against those people who are in power. So in other words, these agencies are not free, and that's why the Supreme Court was forced to call the CBI the cage parrot.
He did not specify, but he said what is colonialism in regard to this small scale sector and the.
Okay. So, colonization meant that the market of the colony was being captured by the colonizing power. So like the British captured the Indian market. So there was deindustrialization in India in the 1860s, 70s and 80s, right? Because they captured the market and the Indian industry suffered. Similarly, now the organized sector is capturing the market of the unorganized sector and growing rapidly, while the unorganized sector is now declining in the economy. So that's why I call it the colonization of the unorganized sector by the organized sector, just like the Indian market was colonized by the British colonial powers.
Okay, now no more questions. With this, we conclude this session. Thank you very much. Whenever we ask you, you are there to help us, to speak to us. We thank you. And we also thank all the audience who are watching this program. This program will be available on YouTube also. After 2-3 days, you can watch it on YouTube also. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to you for organizing it.